Today, we are talking about a difficult topic here on the Dr. Sandoval Show. What can we do with a loved one who we really don't feel like we can keep around the house anymore, and yet we feel like we're responsible for them? This is a challenging situation. We're talking in particular about bipolar disorder and about drug addiction because the fallout is kind of the same when our loved one doesn't follow through with the treatment or doesn't recognize that they have a problem. Before the break, we were talking about in bipolar disorder, somebody could get treatment, they could get medication, and there are good medications for it, mood stabilizers, antidepressants as needed, depending on what they need for their symptoms. These are all important things to consider. However, what if our loved one decides, I don't want to take the medication anymore, I'm actually okay? And you're telling them, no, you're not okay. You're okay on the meds. The meds are helping out, keeping you stable. But our loved one decides, no, that's not what I want. That can be really, really challenging. The other thing is, what if our loved one, very similarly, and this is why I say drug addiction is very similar in terms of the pattern or the thought process. And it's true actually of any mental illness, but these are in particular I talk about because the fallout can be much greater. But imagine somebody who's been, addicted to methamphetamine, and they've been at the house and they just stay in their room and they crash and they get high and they have an interesting slew of friends come by. And all of a sudden you tell them, you got to get off these meds. They hit rock bottom. They go to rehab. They're there for a couple of weeks, a month, however long it took them to get clean, sober. They come out of there and they say, you know what? I'm never going to do these drugs again. This is great. And as a loved one, we're thinking, or as a family member who wants to help them out, we're thinking, this is awesome, good. They've seen the light and they're not going to do this anymore. But then after a while, they're feeling pretty good. And they feel like, you know what? One drink won't hurt me. It's okay. I got it. I'm just going to take one hit. I remember how good I felt. Not just one hit, and that's it. Just to have that moment again. And you're telling them, no, what are you doing? No, I got this. I'm in control. It's no different if you think about it. The same thought process of, yeah, I've been doing okay on these meds for so long. I don't need to take them anymore. I'm doing great. That's it. That's all I need. I need to get off the meds. So it's the same thought process of, no, sometimes slow and steady is good. Sometimes staying away from the substances is good. Sometimes, taking your medication is good and it's going to keep things steady. But that can be very, very hard for somebody to accept. And that's challenging. That's challenging to say the least. What do we do in those situations? Our loved one says, I'm just going to do one more hit. Usually they do it without our knowledge. I say usually because there are circumstances where some people say, gosh, I never want to get off these meds. I saw what happened and I'm a professional, or I'm a teacher. I have my own company, whatever it is that people do. And they recognize, nope, I need to stay on the meds and that's all I need. That's great. The cases that I've seen, the people that come to me say, gosh, my kids are like 30 years old. I'm thinking of one in particular where it was a 30-year-old child. I say child because it was the parents that came to me, but their child was now 30. They were living at the home and they said, we always told them, if you do drugs, we're going to kick you out. And, growing up, they knew that was the rule, that there's no drugs in the house. And if all of a sudden they decided that they were going to bring drugs in the house, boy, they couldn't live here. Well, what happened? Well, they started doing drugs. Okay, so what should we do, Dr. Sandoval? And I said, well, you said you were going to kick them out. Now you got to kick them out. Well, they're going to end up on the streets. That's the tough part. I'm not advocating for anybody to kick their loved one out of the house. It's just think things through beforehand. We don't think these things through because sometimes we think, gosh, if I just set up these parameters, you do this, you're going to get kicked out. That's going to be enough for them to not want to do it. But then what happens when that's not enough? What happens when they decide, no, I'm going to do drugs anyway, or I'm bipolar, I'm going to get off my meds, and because I prefer the high. What do I do then? Do I kick my loved one out? That can be tough. That can be really hard. I don't have an answer. I always say every case is on a case-by-case basis individually. I got to take a look at what's going on there. But it can be hard as a parent. I honestly couldn't picture doing that. I don't know if that ever happened in my life. I don't know that I would be able to kick my child out. I understand the feeling. Would I want to? Absolutely. I'd want to say, no, there's no way that comes into this house. I'm trying to build a sober living here. I'm trying to build a good Catholic home. I'm trying to build a virtuous home. Whatever it is we're trying to do as Catholics. And we say, oh no, this throws a wrench in my plans. But the reality is, did it really throw a wrench in our plans? I think sometimes we idealize what our home is going to be like. And all of a sudden we have to be faced with the reality of, you know, this is the cards I've been dealt. All of a sudden my loved one is not mentally stable. What do I do with that? That's not part of my plan either. And is what can become very challenging, because there's so many different things I've seen come into play. You know, especially as I say, people talk, you know, oh, what happened to that family? Oh, where do they go wrong? Where do the parents go wrong? And that has nothing to do with it for the most part. You know, this is where we have to get more educated and better research on how the brain works on neurology. It's really the last frontier of medicine. We don't know everything about how the brain works. I always tell parents, for the most part, you can't blame yourself for this. Now, if the parents were drug addicts themselves and they, brought drugs into the home when the child was very young and they had friends over and they didn't care, and all of a sudden they're clean and sober, their child is now doing drugs, I say, well, you kind of expose them to an example there, and now we're playing cleanup. But a lot of the time, the majority of the time, it's not the parents' fault necessarily. You did everything you could. You got to remember there's a whole society out there. And we have to remember that everybody has a free will. For as much as we can teach our children to say, hey, don't do this, stay away from this, be careful of this, the world, the flesh, and the devil are always going to be there. Where are we going to be in that supportive nature, though? If this happens, when this happens, if this happens to one of our loved ones, this is where it's okay to take that step back and say, look, I'm here to support you to a certain extent, but there's things I can do and there's things I can't do. If you're hungry, I'll make you a sandwich. If you're telling me that you need money, well, I'm going to ask you what you need it for. A lot of times parents are like, no, well, they need to survive. I need to give them money. I need to make sure they're okay. I always tell them, be careful, because you want to set parameters as well. If you know that your loved one is addicted to drugs and they're looking for their next hit, they might just be looking for money to get to whoever's dealing the drugs. I tell parents, be careful of valuables around the house. You got to hide those. Well, my child, I'm treating him like a criminal. I wouldn't say like a criminal. I would say understand what the current temptations are for your loved one. If it is a drug addiction, they are going to be tempted to take things from the house. They might be tempted to look for an open wallet. They might know where you keep your cash. They might know where you keep certain valuables. They might know the code to your safe. Whatever it is, don't put them in that position. Take all that away. You might have to, some people are, so I have to change my whole life around. Sometimes, if that's the case, it depends on each individual situation, and you know your loved one best. What do you think they're going to respond to? They don't always respond to the same things that we think about, but how can I put them in the best possible position? I don't know that they're going to necessarily steal from me, but why give them that temptation? If somebody is bipolar mania, and they're doing better taking their meds, hey, why don't we do this together? It can be a pretty lonely place. It can be a lonely place for somebody to say, gotta take these pills to feel normal. Why do I have to do that? That can be pretty hard. But if we help to normalize it, one, I always tell my patients, think of it as vitamins. They're just your vitamins for the day. That's all it is. If somebody told you were low on vitamin C, and if you didn't take vitamin C, you'd be acting weird. But gosh, you just take your vitamin C and things are stable? Who would say no? Vitamin C, but then the difference is vitamin C is very acceptable by society. If somebody says, oh, I'm low on my vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin D, oh, go for it. Absolutely, you're going to take that. If somebody says, gosh, I got to take my medication to regulate my brain for my bipolar disorder, oh, society is not quite as open. Yeah, at the same time, if you're low on vitamin C, you're not going to be doing really well. I would hate to get scurvy. This is why the pirates, they were called limeys. Why were they always sucking on limes? To make sure that they had their vitamin C and that they didn't go off the rocker, right? So these are important things to consider. We have to normalize this as well, because it's true. It's what happens to our brains. It's what happens to some brains for some people. Now, society is a little bit more forgiving of somebody who's bipolar disorder and they need to take their meds versus somebody who has a drug addiction, because they say, well, the person who has a drug addiction did it to themselves. Kind of. We can look at that, and from a Catholic perspective, we can say, well, it's kind of like us sinning. This is not easy. We have to revert back to the faith. This is the first part. Dr. Sandoval, faith isn't medication. Well, actually, it is. We have to believe that faith, prayer are or the Eucharist, the sacraments, everything that the church teaches, we have to know that it is doing something. It is actually efficacious. Something is happening. How do we know that? Because we have to put our faith in Christ. Let's look at some Bible verses that might help inspire us in these moments. These aren't easy moments. Oh, Dr. Sandoval, so you think that a Bible verse is going to fix my situation? Yeah, I do. I believe that it can. I believe that Jesus does have that power. I believe that miracles can still happen. I believe that when I read the Bible and I read about the miracles that Christ did in the Bible, they were not something ancient, that they are something that is still happening now. Do we have the level of faith? Do we have the level of faith of people who went to Christ, needed healing, and said, I recognize that you are Christ? It takes something inside of us to get to that point. What was the difference between those people and us? Well, I don't know in that respect. I don't know because I was asked that question. So what's the difference, Dr. Samuel? What's the difference between, that happening before? That was before. That's when Jesus was here. Wasn't Jesus still here? Can he not heal the same way? Can he heal us from our physical infirmities? Absolutely. When some of these people came to Christ, though, what was their heart like? This is what's important. How can we convince our hearts to be like those people? Ultimately, if you look at in the Bible, they had nothing to lose at that point. It seemed like those people were at rock bottom. I think about the lady who was hemorrhaging. I think about the blind man. I think about the man who had the crippled hand. And by the time they got to Christ, they were at the point where they were thinking, I don't care what anybody thinks about me. I don't care what people say. I know my situation, and I know that he's the only one who can heal it. I know that I have to get to Christ, and I can be made fun of. I can be killed. Because think about it. Christ was killed because he wasn't allowed to say that he was Christ. And if you acknowledge him as Christ publicly and you say, no, that is the Son of Man, you risk being killed too. That's what St. Peter was scared about. Aren't you his friend? Oh, I don't know that guy. Why didn't St. Peter say, yeah, that's the Son of God? I believe that. Miracles could have happened at that point. But we get scared. But these people who were crippled, who had nothing else, they were going to Christ and saying, he's the one. At a risk. Well, what does Jesus tell us? He says in Matthew chapter 11, 28 to 29, come to me, all of you who are tired from carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke and put it on you, and learn from me, because I am gentle and humble in spirit, and you will find rest. These are important Bible verses, and I like that one a lot because we forget that when we're dealing with this, whether it be the person suffering from either bipolar, drug addiction, we can do any mental illness, and they're really schizophrenia, anything along those lines, it's not peaceful. It's not restful. If you're suffering from it or you're the loved one trying to take care of them, there's no sense of peace there. There's always a sense of when is the next episode going to happen? And that can be really hard. That can be really hard to live with. And it can be really hard to experience too, because, somebody who's going through these things, at some level, they're pretty scared, but they don't want to say it. They're just following this feeling. They're scared of not being loved. They're scared of not feeling good. They're scared of always feeling bad. They're scared of feeling emotionally spent and drained. And Christ is telling us he's going to give us peace. Well, listen to this one on peace. John chapter 14, verse 27. Peace is what I leave with you. It is my own peace that I give you. I do not give it as the world does. Do not be worried and upset. Do not be afraid. Dr. Sandoval, how can I not be worried or upset about my loved one? Absolutely. Absolutely, I say that. Of course, you're going to be concerned. But what does Christ tell us? Christ tells us that at a certain point, we have to rely on his medication. I'm not against medication, obviously. I'm a physician. I prescribe medication. If somebody is experiencing bipolar disorder, or you know them, or you are experiencing it yourself, of course, I recommend taking, whether it be your lithium, your valproic acid, your Lamictal, whatever it is that was prescribed for you as a mood stabilizer. It might be on aripiprazole. There's all these different medications out there, and whichever one works best for you, I say keep taking it with the guidance and the direction of your physician. That's important to keep taking. There's nothing wrong with you in that sense of taking medication. But that means that I'm sick. It means that your brain's working in a certain way. It's no different than having high blood pressure. Does that mean I'm sick? No, it just means that if I don't take this, something bad could happen. I could end up with a stroke. I want to regulate my blood pressure, right? Yeah, I take medication for my blood pressure. Nobody bats an eyelash. The hard part is the stigma of mental illness is there because if I don't take my medication, I can wreak havoc. I can cause a lot of problems in a family, in a home, in an environment, at work. And the consequences of not taking the medication are much more severe. Now, where's my heart in all this? At some point, I have to find rest. I have to find some peace. And I have to turn to Christ, whether I'm a loved one or the person going through it, and recognize, this is turbulent now, but I truly believe that I'm going to go to something better. I'm going to go to a place where there is peace. Let's look at James chapter 5, verse 15 through 16. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The earnest prayer of the righteous person is powerful and effective. Dr. Sandoval, I believe that my family's cursed, and I believe that this is why we suffer from addiction and bipolar and mental illness. I believe somebody placed a curse on my family. Okay. I never discount these things. I don't say no necessarily. I don't say yes because I don't know it to be true per se. But then if that's the case, if somebody feels like, because this happens sometimes, I feel like this has to do with some kind of a evil affliction that's on my family. Well, what are you doing about that? Are you renouncing curses? Are you going to pray? Are you saying, I'm going to live my life in a way that I love only Christ and that I will put my faith in him? As St. James tells us here, the Lord will raise us up. And even if we have sinned, we will be forgiven.